Good morning, everybody. So, yesterday we left off talking about Jean Lamarck, who he was the guy who believed that use versus disuse, and his thoughts were that if you used a trait, that it got bigger, bigger, better, and stronger, and that if you didn't, that the organism lost it. Of course, now we know that his ideas and theories were not correct, but it's important to note what people thought before we had the current ideas about natural selection. So, today we're going to start talking about Charles Darwin. That's a picture of him in the bottom right hand corner of your screen. And that's him as an old man after he had published his book that outlined his principles about how things changed on Earth. So, as a young man, Charles Darwin got a job as a naturalist and as the captain of the ship's companion on a ship that was called the HMS Beagle. The HMS stands for Her Majesty's Ships because he was sailing out of England. And so on this ship, they were traveling all around the world, and one of the stops that they got to was off of the coast of Ecuador was a series of islands called the Galapagos Islands. And that is off of the coast of South America. And while he was visiting those islands, he noticed that each one of the islands had their own unique, like a little microclimate. And so things that were on each island that were available to the organisms varied from island to island. So in the bottom right hand corner here, you can see the series of islands that he went to. The largest one is Isla Isabella, and but all of those other smaller islands had unique animals that seemed like they probably were related to each other, but maybe not. But they had their own unique characteristics. So one of the species that, or one of the groups of species that he studied were the finches. And we're going to talk a lot about the finches because one of the New York State required labs talks a lot about the finches. But he also studied, while he was on the islands, turtles, the tortoises, and he also studied the iguanas that were on the different islands, beetles that were on the iguanas, and lots of other different things. So, an interesting story about when he went to collect the different beetles, and he would collect things, the specimens, and then he would preserve them so that he could take them back with him to London. And when he was out walking one day, he noticed a beetle. He grabbed it up in his right hand, and he kept walking along the island. And but he didn't. He saw another beetle, so he grabbed that up with his left hand, and he kept walking. But he didn't have any specimen jars with him, and he didn't have any way to contain the beetle, so he just kept them in his balled up in his fist. And so he kept walking along, and then he saw a third beetle that he wanted. So he did not have a place to hold the other two beetles. So he decided, okay, I want this beetle really bad. So he popped one of the beetles into his mouth, and he grabbed the third beetle so that he could have that. So um, I haven't seen his specimens, but if you go to England ever, you can visit museums that have his actual finches that he studied and his other specimens, like some of his barnacles and other things that he looked at that are on display both in his house, that is called the Sandwalk, and also in several museums around all around England. His book that he wrote later in life was called The Origin of Species, and that outlined his principles of of evolution. One of the things that I find really interesting about Darwin, and I believe I might have told you guys this story earlier, is that he actually, when he got back from his trip, he had to make a choice of whether or not he was going to carry on with studying about um, scientific endeavors, or if he was going to decide to get married. He thought that he couldn't do both. So, but he was really interested in the ladies, and so he decided to start courting some of the young ladies around his area. So, two of the ladies that he was most interested in were the Wedgwood sisters. And another interesting thing to note is that the Wedgwood sisters they were Charles Darwin's first cousins. So he became particularly interested in Emma Wedgwood, and so he started courting her. And as he fell more and more in love with her, he had some questions. He wasn't sure if he should marry her because he thought that it might take away from his scientific studies and distract him. Um, and another thing that he was worried about is the fact that they were first cousins. So there was a lot known about artificial selection and how breeding animals who are too closely related to each other um, could cause problems. And so he didn't want to have that happen with his own children. He made a T chart, kind of like what I have you make when we're comparing and contrasting two things. And he wrote on one side the pros of getting married, and on the other side, he wrote the cons of getting married. And ultimately, it came down on that there were more things that were in the positive column than that were in the negative column, and he and Emma did get married. They had several children, and those were really the light of Charles Darwin's life. He really was very much a family man, and he came to find out that even though he obviously probably was distracted by his kids at some point, that he also found them to be easy to study, and he would write about his studies of his children in his journals and in his works. So, and of note, Emma became she became his editor for his works. And Darwin was a notoriously terrible speller, so Emma helped him with all of those kind of things. And they became really very much a team throughout their lives. So it's a pretty interesting thing to learn about, and there are plenty of online resources that you can, if you're interested in their story, that you could look them up about. So in Darwin's theory, he had certain points about how he thought that all of this worked. Um, he really hesitated to publish anything about his works for many years because he knew that even though he had a very good suspicion about how things worked, he did not want to go against any teachings of the church. Early in Darwin's life, he had wanted to become a minister, so that part was pretty important to him. Um, but he came up with this his theory about natural selection, and you can use the bears that are in the bottom right hand corner as an example of how this all worked as we go through the points. So the first point was that he felt that for all organisms that more are born than actually can survive. And so he called this overproduction. And so um, we can think about this in like a clutch of birds. So when birds are when a most birds lay eggs, they might lay, say, five in the nest. So, according to Darwin, not all of the five are going to survive. That some of them might starve, some of them might not learn to fly, some of them might get eaten by cats. There are lots of reasons why they might survive, but he said that there were more organisms than that were produced than could actually survive. The second um, point of his theory was competition. He felt that organisms had to compete with each other for resources to survive. So if you take the bears that are over in the right hand corner, they're going to compete with each other for food, for mates, for space to live in, for dens, all of those kind of things. That would give them different types of competition. If you think about our bird example, they would compete for different types of food. Again, they might compete for mates. They might compete for nesting sites. So those would be the ways that they would compete. We call that the struggle for survival. The third point of his theory was that there would be variation within the population. So, if you look at my bear examples, you can see that they have variation in size and in coat color, and based on the fact that one of them is sitting down and one of them is walking away looking like they're disgusted with the one that's sitting down, then that might even be variation in behavior. So, if you think about in the bird example, there might be variation in their feathers, there might be variation in the length of their legs, there might be variation in um, their songs. And when you think about humans, we have lots of variation too. You can think about differences in height, differences in behavior, differences in skin color, differences in hair color. All of those are different variations that would make um, the organism more or less likely to be able to pass their genes down to future generations. Darwin didn't, of course, know about genes, but he did understand that somehow organisms can pass their traits down to their children. Um, and if we were in school, I would show you, I have some shells, some small little shells that when you look at them, um, and I can't get back in the school to get them because, we're locked out. But I normally give each student 10 of the shells and then have them look at the different variations. So there are differences and variations in the striping patterns, differences and variations of the color. All of those would make them more or less likely to be eaten by predators and more or less likely to survive until they can have baby shells of their or baby mollusks of their own. So the fourth um, part of Darwin's theory of natural or theory of um, evolution is natural selection, and this is survival of the fittest. He believed that the ones that were best adapted to their environment were the ones that were going to be able to survive, and he believed that the ones that were less adapted were the ones that were going to die. I am going to post some videos of some birds that are dancing so that you can see the different variations that the birds might have and how they might be more or less likely to attract the female birds so that they will mate with them. Excuse me. So the less adapted organisms are going to be dying. We now understand that if organisms can't live long enough to mate, that they would not pass their traits on to future generations and that their genes would actually die out. The fifth part of Darwin's theory was reproduction. And so he felt that the ones that were the best fit for the environment were the ones that actually got to mate and have babies. So, in the case of the birds, the ones that live long enough to mate are the ones that are going to have a clutch of eggs, and then their um, traits are going to be passed on to the future generation. Reproduction is probably the most important driver of whether or not evolution actually occurs, because if an organism lives for many, many years, but does not have a mate that they can mate with or does not get the chance to mate, then their genes won't be passed down to future generations and that trait is going to be lost. And the last thing is that the organisms actually finally then do develop into new species. So over time, the traits will start to change in the organisms and then a new species will develop. So the Galapagos turtles and other reptiles, these are some examples of, they're actually tortoises that he studied on the island. And you can see the tortoises up in the right hand corner with a bunch of tourists who are around um, looking at them on the different islands. The shells are shaped differently, the heads are shaped differently, their legs are shaped differently, and they behave differently. They also eat different things according to the different islands, which gives them different survivability. The different iguanas, I know they call them lizards, but they are actually different types of iguanas. Some of them swim in the ocean, and some of them are more land iguanas. Some of them dive down to get different uh, vegetation off of the bottom, and it's really interesting to see the differences on the different islands. So down on the bottom of the screen, you can see different birds that are on the Galapagos Islands. The albatross is on the right. That is a fascinating bird that they can fly for long, long distances without actually having to come down for food or rest. And the blue-footed booby on the left-hand side, I'm going to show you, I'll post a video of the blue-footed boobies mating dance. They also have red-footed boobies on some of the other islands, and the male birds show off to the females to get them to mate with them what they think is their most attractive attribute, which are those blue feet. They hold them up, they have like a little dance that they show to each other, and if the women think that their feet look good enough, then they'll allow them to mate with each other. So it's pretty interesting. This is a picture of a different type of tortoise on one of the different islands, and you can see that this tortoise has a longer neck, and it enables this tortoise to be able to um, eat at a higher level. So the islands of the Galapagos are so small that even small variations can um, end up with big variations in the organisms that live there over a pretty short generation of time. I will post some videos that you can watch so that you can see this as well. The next person that we're going to talk about is Alfred Russel Wallace. Alfred Russel Wallace was a contemporary of Charles Darwin. He was a younger man, and Charles Darwin was really kind of Wallace's hero. Wallace went on also an expedition around the world, and he noticed the same things that Darwin noticed, but he noticed them um, on a different set of islands. He noticed them on the Malay archipelago, which is in Malaysia, and he did notice that the organisms on those islands also had very different traits based on which island that they were located on. He first went to the Amazon, and while he was on the Amazon, he was collecting lots and lots of different specimens, and he started developing his ideas and his thoughts about how organisms came to be different from each other. However, on his way back to England, his boat caught fire, and all of his organisms were lost. and there were thousands of organisms. And so he was really devastated by the loss. He thought that he would never actually go traveling again. But it wasn't too much later in 1854 that he started on his travels to the East Indies. While he was there, they stopped on several islands in the Malaysian archipelago, and he collected thousands and thousands of specimens, and he was most interested in amphibians and in butterflies. And so there are many, many organisms on this archipelago that he that are actually named after him. He wrote a book called The Malay Archipelago, and he dedicated that to Darwin because, like I said, Darwin was really his hero. This is a picture of Wallace's flying frog, and you can see that one of the unique characteristics that it has are webbing in between its toes, and its toes are really, really long. So this frog, it can't actually take off and fly like a bird or a butterfly, but what it can do is soar very much like a flying squirrel. So when it jumps, it spreads out the webbing, and it can soar from one place to the other and be able to jump with much greater distance than frogs that are similar to it. This is where the Malay Peninsula is, and one of the things that he noticed is that there was a distinct line from where animals were placental, which means that they gave birth to live young, very similar to like a human or a dog or a cat. We are all placental mammals. And the on the right hand side of the picture is animals that are marsupials, very much similar to like a kangaroo or a possum or a wallaby or any of those. So where the line is to the right or to the east, those are all marsupials, and to the left or to the west, those are all placentals. He he wasn't sure about what could have caused that, but he thought that maybe it was something to do with how these had been separated from each other. In earth science, you probably learned about Pangea and about um, the um, crust and the movement of the plates of the earth, and that's what they think really caused this, is that these were separated very early on, and that the organisms that are closer to Australia, you can see to the east of Wallace's line there is Australia, and the ones that were closer to Australia, they believe are more closely related to each other than the ones that are on the west of the line. And those that are on the west of the line, they believe evolved in a similar way, and that became the placental mammals. So if we compare Darwin versus Wallace, Darwin believed in natural selection. Wallace called it survival of the fittest. Really, today we use those terms pretty much interchangeably. Darwin considered sexual selection as a separate phenomena. Wallace believed that it was a form of natural selection. And when I say sexual selection, it meant like the birds who were deciding, the female birds, which were deciding which of the male birds um, that they would mate with. Now we all consider sexual selection to be a form of natural selection. Darwin believed he did believe in the inheritance of acquired traits, so he had something in common with Jean Lamarck. Wallace totally rejected Lamarck's idea from the beginning. Darwin also stressed that competition was the cause of natural selection. Wallace emphasized that environmental pressures forced species to adapt to their surroundings. Um, And really, we now accept that both of these are important things. Environmental pressures actually lead to the competition. So you can see how both of them had similar ideas, but they also did diverge in some of their ideas. And today we have kind of merged both of their thought processes to come up with the modern theory of evolution. So, when we talk about the modern theory of evolution, we have to consider mutations as a source of variation, sexual reproduction as a source of variation, and the crossing over that happens in meiosis. So, all of those are important sources of variation and that lead to organisms being born with different traits that would give them more or less of a chance of being able to mate, survive, mate, and have babies to pass those traits down to their offspring. Speciation is when changes add up over time and that the species get new traits over time. And then, if they are the same species, the definition of that is that they can mate with the similar organisms and that they can have viable, fertile offspring. If they can't have viable, fertile offspring with each other, then they are considered to be two different species. If they can have viable, fertile offspring, but they don't because they are separated by geography or behavior, then they are still considered to be two distinct species. So the real defining um, characteristic of a species is if two um, similar can actually mate with each other and have offspring together. So, how do we get one species to become two? One of the main things is that the organisms can be isolated in some way. So, one of the ways that this can happen is geographically. So, there might be some obstacle that keeps the two species separated from each other, such as a river or a mountain or an ocean. There might also be behavioral things that keep the two species separated from each other. Examples of that would be maybe that they mate at different times of the year, or it might be that some of them are awake at night, nocturnal, and some of them are awake during the day, so they might be diurnal. It might also be that they have different feeding times. So some of them may feed early in the morning or in the afternoon or at night. Those different feeding times are going to determine whether or not they actually come in contact with each other where they could find each other for mating. Other things that might isolate two populations would be mating dances. And when I should put up the videos of the mating dances, you will definitely see that they are very different as to what is going to attract the mates to each other. So then these differences build up over time and they become more and more different from each other and less likely to be able to mate with each other. When the two populations finally can't or don't mate with each other and produce fertile offspring anymore, they are considered to be different species. So, what I would like for you to do right now is to take a moment to use Darwin's principles and explain using your own words in your notes, just for practice, why a doctor would not be able to continue to give a patient the same antibiotic over time. And we're going to stop here for now. And then tomorrow I will pick up here and we'll talk about why the doctors wouldn't be able to give the patients the same antibiotic over time. So I look for the videos that I'm going to post about the bird mating dances, and I will post some other videos and watch those at your leisure today or over the next few days, and I will post something new tomorrow. Have a great day.